Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Healing Visionaries online show. Today we have Dr. Kennan Taylor with us. I'd love to tell you a little bit more about his interesting background before we get involved in talking with Dr. Kennan. Dr. Kennan works as a druman, which is a term for healer, seer, and medicine man in Old English. The term druman derives from the Celtic tradition in the figure of the druid as applied in the Anglo-Saxon era, as well as from the ancient well of Shamanism. Kennan's former work as a medical practitioner, holistic physician, Jungian analyst, and medical psychotherapist seems now but a preparation for this path. He brings this tradition into modernity through the agencies of shamanism, alchemy, creativity, medicine, and magic. His work is with the soul, first and foremost and fundamentally. The therapeutic and teaching work is interactive and works with the shadows that obscure the soul's light to discover in illness and suffering the yearning for change and a deeper, more authentic life. Kennan's task is to ground and apply this work in his chosen home of Australia. He works independently of all institutional and other socio-political structure. Today's topic is all about shamanic medicine and the magical arts of the Anglo-Celtic era applied to the challenges of medicine and healing in today's modernity. Welcome, Dr. Kennan. It's great to have you on the show, and thank you for your time with us.
Hello, Cailin. Welcome.
Yes. Well, I'm really interested in your background, coming as a psychotherapist and working in the medical field, and then coming into this area of magic and working as a druman and shamanism. Can you give us some of the backstory, how that happened?
Oh, it would take all day. But I mean, essentially, I think I always had a bit of a yearning for something different. My path into medicine was fairly indirect anyway, but I went to some fairly prestigious institutions and trained. But over the years, I suppose I sort of saw more of the psychological and emotional background in health and in medicine generally. And my own life journey took me into therapy, my own personal therapy. I did a Jungian analysis when I was 28, when I had a sort of awakening experience. And that sort of started off a parallel path. Jung, I found, was really a very, very important figure. And not so much for his analytical and therapeutic work, which I practiced for many years, but more for his inquiry into tradition, spirituality, mysticism, and particularly areas like alchemy and magic. And that got me going. And I spent many years trying to integrate that back into my medical practice. I was a holistic physician, so I did a lot of mental health work, but I always stayed grounded in physical medicine. But increasingly over the years, with the increasing politicization of medicine, its protocol drivenness, pharmaceutical control, all that sort of stuff, I just found it really, really difficult. And I went through a couple of my own crises. We all do, you know, one my own health, the other was the loss of a partner. And things like that sort of really just increasingly took me into the spiritual world. And particularly after the loss of my partner, I moved location and started a healing retreat where I worked for about 25 years, mainly privately, initially in medical practice. But eventually I couldn't do it anymore. I was sort of decombusting, trying to get the two together. And for every supporter within mainstream, there was a good number who weren't. And the writing was on the wall. So when I got to a cherished age, I thought, I'm not going to last if I keep doing this. So I jumped ship and decided to work entirely in the psychospiritual areas and to take what I'd learned from practice into that. And particularly, as I said, the Jungian work and some of the other depth psychologies and the therapies that were around in the 70s and 80s when we were all doing primal and rebirthing, because they've had a big say in how I look at things like soul loss and soul retrieval. So the work I do with soul loss and soul retrieval and spirit possession or psychic possession is somewhat different to probably what you've met so far.
Oh, what do you mean? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, I mean, because of my work in sort of things like areas like primal work and rebirthing, I've seen that how those techniques can be applied more deeply. And I use a sort of combination approach, which can be considered just a soul retrieval, sometimes helping the client do it themselves, because that's an extension of psychotherapy in some respects, or sometimes on behalf of the client, depending. But often you meet issues which are somewhat possessive. And you could see that in psychological language as things like complexes or archetypal possession if you're Jungian. And sometimes you've got to work around that as well. So I found those areas I experimented with in the 70s, 80s and 90s were really valuable in sort of forming the way I work now. Yeah.
What are some of the modern psychology? How is psychology relevant to shamanic healing?
Well, to be quite honest, I don't think academic research or even clinical psychology is much, because it's mainly rational. It's driven pretty much by cognitive behavioral type of approaches. And it's aimed at, a little bit like Western medicine, it's aimed at sort of problem solving, support, fixing issues, but not really exploration and not really character change. In fact, it's defined not to be that way. So the depth psychotherapy is starting off with people like Freud and Reich and Jung, and the latter sort of proponents, people like Guattari and company like that, have all sort of been more adventurous and taken, I think, a more psychospiritual orientation and worked more fundamentally with the soul. Certainly Jung did. And he was indirectly sort of my mentor for many years. So you won't find it in mainstream, not these days, even less so than 30 years ago. You know, when most of us were kicking around the path and trying different things 30 years ago, the depth psychotherapies you could move into conventional psychology and medicine. It's really difficult now. It's been largely sort of kept away because we've become increasingly mechanistic and rational, which is a problem. Because particularly in medicine, when you're looking at healing, you're not looking at the changes that the illness or the wounding or the trauma demand for genuine healing. You're looking at the symptomatic expression and alleviating that, sometimes for the client, patient, but very often for the family, the partner, or the social sort of setting. Yeah. So there's a bit of a gulf opened up. Yeah. Yeah. But I think there's sort of some good stuff on the horizon, because when that happens in Jung's terms, the whole issue about medicine as an archetype moves elsewhere. It's moved into alternate fields. It's moved into the new age because natural and gifted people have picked it up. And that will increase. And eventually what will happen is medicine will pick up on it as well. But maybe not in my lifetime.
Yeah. Well, I did many, many years working with different psychotherapists and didn't begin to get anywhere that I'm able to do in this shamanic area and healing arts.
Oh, look, there's many ways you can look at shamanism, as you know, and we've talked about. You can take a restricted view, a more expanded view, or look at it from just a Siberian perspective, or where does the North American Indian fit in, or even here in Australia, where does Aboriginal healing come into it? I get around that by taking a more Jungian approach and saying shamanism represents the healing patterns that are present in all cultures, and whether they get expressed in a particular form, and we call that strictly shamanism, and not in others. I think it's a bit of a moot point. There's elements of it. I mean, certainly my researchers have discovered strong themes that are shamanic in the Anglo-Saxon period, and by inference, the Celtic period as well. I mean, even though they weren't as obviously ecstatic, it must have been there. It just must have, so anyway, I hold to that. And that's what I mean. I take that more broader view, and I think shamanism is more eclectic and it's a term that's used to define people who are looking at healing from that fundamental core perspective. There are certain common features, but I'm not very strict about that.
Yeah. But your particular area of interest is the Anglo-Celtic period.
Absolutely.
How do you use that to inform the healing arts?
Oh, I got drawn there. I mean, I was drawn there because after the death of my partner, I had a serious illness. And I realized, and I migrated to the south of Australia, West Australia, to kind of recover. I had 2 small children to raise on my own at that stage, and also had a medical practice. And I really needed to connect with my background. I'd been in England for only about 20 years, left after I did my medical studies. And consequently, there was a lot that for me was unresolved. And I found Druidry was probably the spiritual framework that best fitted it. So I kind of explored that starting about 30 years ago. And as that happened, amalgamated with my Jungian work, I then started to explore the Anglo-Celtic period in more detail. The obvious area that you can is Anglo-Saxon because it's more recent, and there's writings about it, and the Christians have commented on it, and the runes are there, and there are herbal approaches and charms and magical approaches. You know, when you get into the Celtic era, it's a little bit more distant. But there's, you know, like I said, I think shamanism is a fundamental archetypal framework to healing and dealing with illness and wounds. And when I look at my own path, it's got all the criteria that you'd see in a shamanic path. You know, I'm not wearing feathers, and I don't have a drum immediately around me, but I do have a little bit of a funny cloak, and my hair's a bit long, you know, and so there are elements of it. And I'm living as an expat in Australia. I'm trying to make sense of being here in this amazing country, and what the healing is about here with the indigenous culture here, and the land, which is extraordinarily rich in those sort of backgrounds we're talking about. Wow. So yeah.
So and the soul being also the major part of your work. Can you talk a little bit about how you use that in your tradition?
Yeah, sure. I found the religious concept of the soul very unsatisfactory. I'm sure most of us have. We find it a bit distant, not physical, hooked up too much with spirit, God, call it what you will, and not easily accessible.
Right.
And my work, particularly in wounding, made me realize that there was elements of it that I hadn't really connected with. And I did a master's degree in physiology, mainly neurophysiology at Oxford. And during that period, I became really intrigued about the patterns in our nervous system. And I started, when I stumbled on Anglo-Saxon images and patterns of what the soul looked like, they started to really resonate with my research days. The differences between the 2 hemispheres, the limbic system, related to images of the ravens and traveling and ecstatic experience, and the imagination and creativity and energetics, emotion, sexuality. And I found it relatively easily mapped what I knew of the physiology of the brain and of the body. And then that intrigued me. So I explored it further and found in my Anglo-Saxon researches that there were names for all these components, and that there was a rich notion of the soul as a complex, you know, which energetically contained us and our life experience and our story. And I'm still working with that. I mean, some of that's in the paper, which is the gift that people can have a look at. It's a bit academic because it was a part of an academic delivery, but if you avoid the references, you kind of get the thrust there. It's about comments about medicine, but also about how those patterns and the old English terms map onto a lot of the things that people in your summit are talking about. You know, when I hear some of the other speakers, I go, oh yeah, that's the right brain, or that's the limbic system, or that's the base part of the brain, or the cranial nerves, or the heart and brain connection. And I think it's just an interesting area of inquiry. So that's become my fundamental. I kind of use that around the consulting work I do, which is more verbal. But when we're looking at healing work, I tend to use non-verbal approaches these days. You
At
know,
what
like
point or how do you know when to go into beyond the talk and into the healing?
depends on the person. It just it depends on what they're asking. It depends on the question they have. It depends on whether we fit, you know, in a relationship, and it depends where our inquiry goes. I mean, when I see someone first up, I mean, it's not something I do online, for example. Online is mainly consulting, and psychotherapy in that context is mainly integrative. You know, it's stuff you do maybe after you've been through more primal experiential sessions, or maybe you don't. Maybe the experience is enough. So I'm really quite flexible. But when I'm working with clients, I tend to sort of use music, a mattress, breath work, relaxation approaches, and then either to help a person move into an altered state. Sometimes I go into the altered state with them, sometimes I do it on their behalf. It kind of depends. And like I hinted earlier, sometimes you hit roadblocks where there's something really getting in the way energetically, and you've got to move into more dealing with things that are impeding or possessing. And that can be more primal in a way. Sometimes it involves direct physical involvement with the person. It kind of depends. You just got to go with it, really. But
I think almost everybody's got something always in the way or needing, you know,
yeah,
there's
we would,
always something, even
would
when,
we be on the planet otherwise? You know, we've all got these journeys. We've all got. I mean, it's like, I mean, one of the fundamentals of shamanism is your own wounding. You know, it's like that's what draws. I mean, anybody who's a healer, and you've met many, you know, in this journey, all got our wounds. We've all had to deal with them, and sometimes we continue to deal with them. Sometimes they revisit us, but we get to know that if you don't face them, you know, life stops for you. You know, either psychically and
yeah,
or sometimes physically. And that's what I used to see in medicine. That's what distressed me so much about medicine. You'd see people with terminal illness who had missed that opportunity,
yeah,
and were also denied that opportunity because the protocols and the modern regulations don't allow you to move into those areas. You know, particularly when they're very fundamental, and particularly often when they involve core issues like sexuality, which is a really difficult area to go into these days. Yeah.
oh, in therapy, you mean, in the talk therapy?
Oh, talk therapy or in work in general. I mean, Freud over 100 years ago said, hang on a minute, guys, nearly everybody I know who's crook has got a sexual problem. So let's go and dig away for it. I mean, okay, that was over-inclusive. But he pointed out, and we've known since then, that primary energetics and sexual energetics are so fundamental, you know, in our being. And unless, and it's almost invariable, particularly in the West, that it comes up. But therapies, and that's one reason why I think conventional psychologies and medicine have trouble, because they really don't approach it these days.
Right.
There's so many inhibitions and taboos in doing so. It's a
Well,
tricky
even
area.
when I was going, I used to seek out what were called Gestalt therapists because they were more interactive.
Yeah.
Even she would say, you got to stop with this magical thinking.
Yeah.
Because at the time I was also starting to do a lot of ceremonies and connect with a Native American community that was bringing me in. And well, I just ended up switching over to the Native American way because I was having such enormous breakthroughs in connecting with the spirit world and getting stronger on my path. So like that therapist saying to, you know, then I asked the grandmother, but, you know, she just said, you know, this can do so much more than any therapy is ever going to be able to reach.
Look, I think you're right, and a lot of work I do is, I mean, some of it's taken from psychology, some of it's taken from Druidry, some of it's taken from elsewhere, but the pattern of ritual and ceremony is very important. You know, for a long time we've conducted regular ceremonies, you know, because the challenge in being in Australia is what are the ceremonies here? You know, the sun goes around the opposite way. You know, we've got a different mapping process. We've got different heavens above us and different star systems. We've got different seasons. You know, we don't have the seasons that I was used to in Britain, in England. So working with, working with those ceremonies and then the rituals in them. And also, I very early on started a sweat lodge process. We built an underground sweat lodge, and the property was on, and still do sweats. But for many years, we conduct them on a regular basis, and I try to take in the more Anglo-Celtic patterns into them. And we still do that. You know, I go down about once a month and do a sweat lodge. Great. Yeah, we're planning to build one just.
If it's underground, what's the purpose of the underground?
Oh, just because it's more primal and it's more because the sweat lodges we're using are permanent, semi-permanent.
Yeah, then you don't have to rebuild the willow.
Well, it was just based on an idea. It's like, I think the sweat lodge process or the sweat house process is again like shamanism in all cultures in some way. So it was just like, well, how are we going to build one? And we had a look at the ground and thought, God, it'd be really nice if we da-da-da-da-da. So we dug down about 2 or 3 feet and just tunneled into it, and then built a dome over, and we've been using that for about 15 years now. Yeah, 15, 20 years.
Wow, long time.
Yeah. And it's quite, it's a different energetic. I mean, I've done it in ones we've made, and was originally based on North American patterns because I was taught by someone who had trained with the Lakota. But I've gradually moved it into a more Anglo-Celtic format. So we use things that are common to things like core shamanism, like the tree and the upper world and the lower world and the mid world and the 4 quarters, and the elements and the attributes of the quarters, blah blah blah, and journeying. And we use a chant. We use the charm of making. Have you heard the charm of making? Did you ever see Excalibur?
Tell us.
It's a charm or a spell which is literally, it's from old Gaelic or Cornish, but you know, again, the academics will have would shoot me, I think, if I sort of made it this simplistic. But it's various Gaelic tongues put together, and it means something like breath of the serpent, spell of death and life, charm of making. It's threefold, you know, which is fairly Celtic. And in the pattern we use, you can use an alternative translation like, come hither ye ancestors, emerge from the mists, let form be created. And the chant, for anybody who's heard, who's watched John Borman's Excalibur movie, it's now 40 years old, brilliant movie, which encapsulates my passions and interests. Merlin, the figure of Merlin, uses the charm of making to weave his magic. And the charm goes something like this. Anal nathrak, uthas befud, dachiel dienve. And you can clap it and do it as you create a circle. Anal nathrak, uthas befud, dachiel dienve. Anal nathrak, uthas befud, dachiel dienve. If you watch the movie, you watch Merlin do it, it's a bit more dramatic than me. But we use things like charms like that in the sweat lodge, and prayers. Some prayers we've borrowed, and some, you know, like we use a prayer about being in this land, which goes something like this. We acknowledge this land and all who live herein. We honor our ancestors, treasure our heritage, and willingly pledge our troth. And then we announce, yeah.
Good
I've
one.
got a jumble of those that we use, and we take those into the ceremonies, and we take those into the sweat lodge, and then people can bring their journey, and sometimes they conduct a journey there. Yeah.
In another episode, we were also talking about the power of words, that actually saying these out loud really makes the difference.
Look, yeah, and this is kind of where it drifts a little bit into awkward territory, because prophecy and oratory are my skill, and the use of words is my talent. It's why I was a psychotherapist, for God's sake. You know, I mean, it is. I can do it. I can move around it and move into those spaces and find that words can be very invocative and evocative with myself and with people. And because I did a lot of dream work around that, and there is a tradition in the magical area of Anglo-Saxon magic called Galdor, which comes from the Norse, which is about the use of the word and about the use of chants and charms and spells. Which is a little bit more controversial. And that's often put down to Odin or Woden in English. And it complements the magic of Saith or Seda, which is more feminine and more associated with trance tradition. And this is one reason why I think the Celts would have had trance. I think fairies and blah, 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 blah are all elements of trance. I think, and because we've got the recordings have taken the more Galdor side of things rather than the safe side of things. We haven't quite connected as much with alter states, ecstatic states, but the women in those periods seem to have been the masters or enchantresses of it. And if you look at myths in some depth, it's all there. You know, it's just not said, oh yeah, what the enchantress did was went and did a little and did this and then took this plant, and you know, but it doesn't take a lot of imagination. And the two work together. The figure of Woden learned Saith magic from Freya. So there is a combination of the two. There's the power of the word, but there's also the energy of the imagination and creativity. Which is also often associated with sexuality, because Freya is quite a significant goddess of sexuality. You know, I'm running around.
I named my bunny rabbit Freya.
Absolutely.
I had a house rabbit.
All those fertility eggs. But I think it's an absorbing area. You know, like we if you look at it with that sort of imaginative and creative eye, that there's a lot can be discovered. Yeah, okay, some of it's revivalist, some of it's my imagination. Yeah, but I think that's part of the recreation process we're in this era. And that's what I felt was lacking in medicine and psychology was we didn't have access to these deeper patterns. So that's been my journey, is to try to reconnect with them and have them inform my life and my work. And also people I work with and a few people I teach with that. And I don't consider myself really a teacher. I'm too marginal. You know, I'm too much a one-man show. But there are a few people I work with, and because we kind of connect and work together. But it's not formal. But then again, apprenticeship never was really, was it? You know, and I felt that I've learned from sort of 2 or 3 significant people, kind of indirectly. It wasn't part of a formal study pattern. It did all that with medicine anyway. Yeah, but even in medicine, you know, what I learned from medicine wasn't the formal stuff. It was the teachers who told stories. You know, here at this age now, I remember all the stories. I can't remember any of the facts. You know, but I remember all the stories. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you find where you are in Australia, there are a lot of people interested in this coming to you?
No, it's very. Do I find a lot of people doing it? No, not really. Not by comparison. And when I've worked with people from overseas, they've suggested I go back to England or go to New York, or because there'd be a bigger audience. but I feel really committed to being here.
Yeah.
And even though the grouping that we've got isn't big by any manner of standard, it's committed, and we're all finding our feet here, being in Australia, and there's a sense with us that we're here for a reason, and that keeps me here. So for many years now, I haven't really travelled. It's frustrating at times. One of the upsides is this online, being able to connect with people, like already in your summit, you know, like I see one of the speakers and go, oh, I'll friend them on Facebook, and then something happens. And I'm starting to learn more and interact more, and that enriches me. And, you know, I find out where I'm going wrong in my thinking or the work I'm doing. And, you know, and a combination of that socially and community-wise is really, really important, particularly when you look at the world and, you know, have a look at what's going on. It demands us, I think, to be more contained and alchemical in our work, and careful about who we connect to. You know, I in medicine, one of the biggest stresses for me was there was no boundary. Anybody could come and see you. They'd make an appointment. And most times that wasn't appropriate. And even though I got better at creating a boundary, it still was really difficult. I mean, one of the blessings now being outside the medical system is somebody will contact me directly and ring me or email me, and I'll know fairly quickly whether the fit's there and whether it's right to work with them. And it makes it selective, but it works. It works for me.
Yeah. And I love it when you're not, you know, nobody in this area is ever really functioning from the point of desperation or needing.
No, we're all in the heart.
So you can, you just take who resonates.
Yeah. You know, we've all come to this, and we all realize that's, I think, why we're here. You know, I've got a well-trained and quite strong intellect, and I've got good oratory, but I these days feel it always comes from here first. And I'm working from that space with people, and it's rewarding. And it's, you know, you realize at times that you're part of something that probably preceded you and probably will post-date you, and your task is maybe just to keep the wheel going, you know, and particularly in dark times, and we have some dark times around us. That's one reason.
The wheel going.
Well, yeah, I think that's the case. You know, like I feel like, particularly in Australia, I feel like Australia's got something to offer the world. You know, we've got an amazingly ancient continent with traditions here, which we've only just touched the surface of. Its scope of it sometimes just really overwhelms me. Wow. And I feel like I'm sitting a little bit on the edge of it, and maybe it'll be people I work with or people who come after, and maybe Australia will offer something back to the world. I suspect it will. I suspect there's something about the spirituality here that's got something for the future. Us being Merlin.
Great. Yeah, because so far, I mean, what most of the world thinks of Australia's spirituality in terms of the indigenous people.
Yeah, there's, for me, it's been more the land. I've had, even in practice, have had very little contact with Aboriginality and the indigenous people, and I think they're coming into the fore now much more than they ever have, and they're being welcomed in a social, community and political way without the difficulties that were there a generation or two ago. But they're finding their connections and reconnecting, and we're finding ours. And I think there's an alchemy.
From their perspective, tons of their own ways are lost already.
Well, there's sort of various invasions here in the last 200 years did a fairly good job of decimating them and making it very difficult. So there's gaps in the generations, as you well know, not just socially, family and children, but also spiritually. And I think we've just got to club together, really, in a way. I feel like I can offer more by just working with my own and working with that, what means to be here in the land, and working with people I come into contact with, and trusting the people I come into contact with are the people I'm meant to connect with. You know, in the last year or two, there's been much more of a sense of connection with traditional people here. And a couple of visits to me to areas that house that, like the Kimberley in northwestern Australia, which is an amazing place, has helped me do that. And I think it's happening subtly, spiritually. I have a sense that that will be part of my future work. But how that is, I don't know. But we and the people, I have a group I work with, and we're moving around this area, and you know, it's some of us, there's a couple of academics, there's a couple of psychologists, there's people who've just naturally skilled, there's people who are wanting to supply in different ways and just support, making the cakes, you know, brewing the tea, doing all that sort of stuff. And I suspect from that, you know, more will happen. And also I've got quite a number of kids, and they're scattered here in Australia, and they've all stayed here. And I have a sense with most of them that's part of our connection, which you'd expect anyway in more shamanic tradition, but that one or two of them would, but quite a number of them have, you know. So, and we connect in that way now, even though I'm getting on in years. My kids range over a 20-year period. I've got 6 of them, and from different areas. It's a long story. You heard a bit of it, but nearly all of them, we nearly all connect in that way now, about, if you could call this work, about this work. You know, yeah, just and it could be about music, or it could be about yoga, or it could be academic. It could be about what our family is in here, or it can be about, I could go on. But we the discussions that we have are a bit about that, and I've probably got a better relationship with them all because of that now. Because as a father, I was something, you know, absent at times and not there at times, and went through my own traumas. But I feel as they're very much involved in being here, and that's part of passing the buck, I think, or passing the baton. Passing the baton's a better word.
So let's say, for example, if you're wanting to connect with this other place, location, like you were talking about, might possibly be in your future, or anybody watching this wanting to connect with a situation, or, you know, bringing something into their life, would you recommend ritual and ceremony, or how do you go about building that connected pathway connection?
I'd certainly recommend ritual and ceremony. Ritual is indispensable part of my life. It permeates all parts of my life now. It's been really important to me for a generation to do that, you know, and you've probably got an impression about the ongoingness of that in being here and in my life, you know, both in retrieval from tradition, and trying to recreate a lot of what was going on, and connecting with other people here. But, you know, a lot of it comes from our own healing and our own sharing and our own intuition, moving around of our imaginings and our ideas. So there's a lot of other, I mean, I could give you a list of about 20 things, modalities, you know, like art and creativity and drama and music and dance. We all know them. But bringing them together, I think, into a more social and community orientation is really important. It's one reason I don't consider myself a teacher, because I don't like hierarchies. And I saw too much of that in the New Age a generation ago. Too many people elevating themselves into teacher status or guru status. I think it's about sharing, you know, it's about me, like I'm sharing with you today, and people making contact with me, and vice versa, and seeing where that goes. But yeah, and simple rituals like, where's the moon at the moment? You know, like, go out and look at it and connect with it. how does that match where your emotional state is? And, yeah, it took me a long time to realize I went ape shit for a few days before each full moon.
I know, depending on the moon sometimes.
But you get out of the city, you sit in the city, you don't see it. You get out of the city when I was down south and you'd look up and go, oh, that explains it. And you look up there and yeah, I think starting that and sharing it, but not making it too formal and keeping it flexible. I think, you know, like moving things around, having ideas about where we're going. You know, there's been a bit of a tendency for people to give ways that to become overly structured, or inferring that they're exclusive or they're the right way.
Right.
I think we're in an era where, in a way, we've almost got to let it all go. You know, if this is the Kali Yuga, that's what you do. You know,
right.
you
Limitless possibilities. There
yeah,
are so many ways.
you work with that primal chaos and, you know, where it takes you. Yeah. You know, I found the older I get, the more structures that I've been given tend to dissipate, you know, more and more. And I like working sort of kind of freelance and a bit nomadic, a bit sort of bohemian.
Well, we should talk about your special offer for the viewers of just this show if they want to get in touch with you and have a session with you.
Yep. Look, I'm happy to have contact irrespective. You know, my website's pretty straightforward. Are we left to right here or right to left? So that goes backwards, does it?
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be backwards. But we have the link. We have your link everywhere in the email on the website.
Okay. I mean, I'm happy to hear from anybody, you know. And regarding an online session, if anybody, you know, has a health issue or wants a rune reading, I work with the runes.
Oh, right.
I've written a few books, and one of them's on the runes. The books are on my on the website, and it's not a very good book, actually. I don't think. I'd like to do a sequel to it.
I'm sure people like your book.
but it's about the Anglo-Saxon runes, and it's about, and I've got a real interest in where they're about, particularly where they connect with the Holy Grail and alchemy. But that's another story. So often online, I do things like it can be a health issue or a personal issue, or maybe wanting to do a rune reading mixed in with that, or just simply to share and have a bit of feedback and for me to sort of engage with someone. So I'm more than happy to do that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's terrific. Yeah.
And there's also, like I said, the paper. They can have a look at the paper and.
Yeah, and you know, I appreciate the footnotes. I like when it's an academic or peer-reviewed article because then it gives me further reading also.
Absolutely. I had a bit of difficulty with it as an academic paper because the references are a bit loose, but on the other hand, they're more intuitive. They're the ones that I think informed me and connected to how the paper took shape. And shamanic medicine is the way I view my work. I sort of see it in that area, and some people might quip and say, well, you can't really call it shamanic. And I go, well, I take a particular viewpoint and I do, you know, and it's medicine, but it's not strictly, but it's medicine in the generic way we see it. So in ways I get around that by just calling my work soul medicine, because fundamentally I'm working with the individual and trying to connect with them. And that's a shared experience. You know, and I like to be there with the process. You know, I like to be involved, be connected. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much for this talk today, Kennan. It's wonderful having you on the program. Is there something we missed? Anything you'd like to say in closing?
I've got some notes here. Let's have a look. Nah, I think that's enough.
It covered a lot. Although I am interested in the Holy Grail story. You just gave us a teaser.
Look, if you haven't seen Excalibur, watch Excalibur.
I have. I've seen it.
Yeah, the second half, because I think the Holy Grail stuff is an immense part of our future. I really do.
Really?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think it's the visionary components of it and what it's saying stretch back right the way into prehistory, And that was what I found in the runes, was when I started looking at the Anglo-Saxon runes, which are different from the Germanic runes. There were the additional runes, particularly the Northumbrian runes, started to indicate to me a really strong alchemical and grail tradition. So that's where I'm at the moment, and I work with a couple of colleagues who are in that area, and we're exploring that, particularly in the runes, and how that applies to alchemy and how that applies to the work we're doing, particularly with clients. So yeah, as long as I keep going like this, I'll keep alive, I suppose.
Very, very cool. We'll have to keep an eye out for that one.
Do.
All
But
right.
connect. Anybody wants to connect, I'm more than happy.
Great. Yeah. Definitely.
And listen, you're doing a great job.
Oh,
Well,
thank you.
it's great. It's great that the effort that you've put into this. I think it's brilliant. Well done.
And it's been an amazing adventure for me. Meeting everybody has been so fantastic, and doing this project so unexpected for me. It's really moving my transformation ahead.
Yeah, we've got talking and laughing, which is great. Yeah. Maybe the listeners can connect to something if we're talking about, or we might be just bantering away between us, but it's fun.
Right, it's fun. And people, I'm sure, get a lot out of these talks.
Thank you.
So thank you. We'll see you again in the future.
Okay, Colin. Bye-bye.